I'm Madison Hale, 30 years old, and tonight my father looked at me like I was a stranger in my own family. He stood near the marble fire pit, whiskey in hand, surrounded by relatives whose laughter always carried an edge of judgment. When he asked if I was still working from home, the words slid out with that familiar smirk, the one that could turn any room cold. I smiled politely, even as my phone buzzed in my pocket. The message on the screen read, "Acquisition of Hale Industrial complete. You now own 100% of your family's company." I slipped it back into my coat without a blink. They had no idea that while they toasted to their legacy, I had quietly taken control of it. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth when someone thought you'd never measure up. Growing up as a Hale meant learning how to be perfect under pressure. Ours was a family that didn't just live comfortably. We lived under our name. Hale Industrial Group had been in business since my grandfather's time, its logo etched into steel and stone across the Midwest. At home, that same pride filled every corner of our house. My father's portrait hung beside plaques and awards, while my mother kept the dining table set, as if company might arrive at any moment. Everything looked flawless, but it always felt rehearsed. My father didn't believe in softness. He believed in standards. My mother believed in keeping the peace. And I, the younger child, learned to keep my questions quiet. Jason, my older brother, was everything my father wanted, sharp, confident, and obedient to the family mold. He was the first to wear tailored suits, the first to have his own office, the one who carried himself like he'd already been handed the keys to the kingdom. When he spoke, people listened. When I did, my father checked his watch. Even as a child, I saw how easily praise flowed toward Jason and how quickly it dried up when it came to me. My ideas were cute, my projects well-meaning, as if ambition was a phase I'd grow out of once I learned my place. At school, I found my own rhythm in science labs and sketchbooks, fascinated by how things worked and how they could work better. I loved designing small systems that made waste disappear, turning scraps into something new. The first time I showed my father a model of a self-powered irrigation pump, he called it a hobby. Jason laughed, said I should focus on real business. Even then, I understood that our family's wealth was built on machines that produced profits, not ideas that protected the planet. But I couldn't shake the sense that industry could do more than make money. It could make change. Our dinners were a ritual of comparison. My father at the head, Jason to his right, me across from them both. Every conversation came down to numbers, contracts won, expansion deals, signed quarterly growth. When I spoke about sustainable design or cleaner manufacturing, I was met with polite silence, followed by a change of topic. Margins matter not. Dreams, my father once said, cutting into his steak without looking up. My mother gave me that gentle smile she always used when she wanted me to stop. I learned to swallow my words to finish my meal to stay invisible. But invisibility grows heavy with time. When I turned 20, I stopped pretending. I told my parents I'd been accepted into Stanford's environmental engineering program. For a moment, no one spoke. My father finally asked, "Why not business? Why not Wharton? Like your brother." I told him I wanted to build things that lasted longer than profit, systems that could sustain themselves and the people they served. His face tightened. "You think you're smarter than the generations who built this family?" he asked. I didn't answer. The silence was my first rebellion. I packed my bags for California, leaving behind a mansion filled with echoes and expectations. At Stanford, I felt air in my lungs for the first time. My professors didn't dismiss ideas for being idealistic. They asked how we could make them real. In lecture halls and late-night labs, I found people who believed in progress, people who wanted to repair, not repeat. Dr. Elise Porter, my mentor, told me one afternoon, "The ones who question the system aren't trying to destroy it. They're trying to evolve it. That scares those who've built their comfort on keeping it the same." Her words stayed with me through every project and every setback. Maybe I wasn't difficult. Maybe I was just different, and difference was the only way forward. While my brother was climbing Hale Industrial's corporate ladder, I was building something smaller but stronger, a company called Verdant Systems. We started with borrowed desks, thrifted computers, and a whiteboard full of impossible ideas. What we lacked in resources, we made up for in resolve. My father called it a passion project. Jason joked that I was playing entrepreneur. I smiled through their laughter because I knew that innovation always begins as someone's joke. By the time I returned home for family gatherings, I had learned to carry my success quietly. The house looked the same, polished, proud, and cold. My father still led conversations about legacy. Jason still interrupted before I could finish a thought. My mother still passed me the bread basket with that look that said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But as they talked about market shares and business awards, I knew something they didn't. The old way of doing things was running out of time. Standing on that patio years later under the string lights and the smell of cedar smoke, I felt the same chill I'd felt my entire life, the space between who I was and who they believed I should be. Only this time the balance had shifted. My father raised his glass to family legacy, and I lifted mine too. He didn't see the message glowing on my phone or the calm in my smile. He didn't know that everything they had dismissed in me, every question, every idea, every late night spent proving I could had brought me to this moment. And by the end of that night, he would learn that the daughter he'd overlooked had quietly become the owner of everything he thought she could never understand. The Hale family name carried weight, the kind that opened doors for some and locked others inside. My father, Richard Hale, liked to say that Hale Industrial wasn't just a company, it was the family backbone, the symbol of everything he had worked to preserve. He had been groomed for leadership from birth, inheriting both the title and the posture of authority from his own father. Even his quietest gestures had purpose. When he walked into a room, conversation paused. When he spoke, it was final. Growing up in that shadow meant learning early that opinions were best kept small and dreams smaller still. Jason fit easily into that world. He spoke the language of margins and market trends before he was old enough to buy a stock. My father introduced him at board dinners like a trophy, my son, the next generation of Hale leadership. I was our daughter, usually followed by a polite smile from my mother and a change of subject. At 12, I started keeping a notebook of ideas for cleaner production systems, sketches of machines that used recycled energy. When I showed it to my father, he flipped through the pages and said, "Interesting, but idealism doesn't pay dividends." He wasn't cruel about it. He just didn't see value in anything that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. That was the first time I realized affection in our family had a price tag. At dinners, business talk filled every pause. My father recited revenue numbers the way others might share family milestones. Jason talked about golf with clients and his growing responsibilities at the West Division. My mother kept her eyes on the table, her hand wrapped gently around her wine glass, as though she could keep the peace by holding still. When I spoke about a research article, a school project, or anything that didn't revolve around Hale Industrial, the air grew heavy. "It's sweet that you care about that," my father would say, "but real work keeps people employed." Jason would smirk, and my mother would glance my way with that look of quiet apology that said, "Let it go, Madison." But I couldn't let it go. I began asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Why did our factories still use outdated fuel systems? Why were workers wearing worn-out safety gear while executives were buying new company cars? My father waved me off every time. "We've done it this way for decades," he'd say, as if tradition itself were proof of success. Jason once leaned close during a barbecue and said, "Dad says idealism is a luxury. Maybe you should try living in the real world for a while." His tone was half teasing, half warning. I stared at the flames and said nothing. The truth was, I already lived in the real world. They just refused to see it. Through high school, I funneled my frustration into work. I built small projects, entered science fairs, and turned my parents' garage into a miniature lab. When I won a state innovation award for a zero-waste production model, my teachers called it groundbreaking. My father called it a clever school stunt. Jason laughed, saying, "That's not how business works, Maddie. You can't save the planet with glue and good intentions." I smiled because that was easier than arguing, but the words stayed lodged somewhere deep like a splinter I'd learned to live with. The night I told them I'd been accepted to Stanford's environmental engineering program, the dining room went silent. "Stanford," my father repeated the word, tasting foreign. "You've always had such a strong sense for communication. Why not business?" Why not Wharton, like your brother? I took a breath and said I wanted to build systems that could last sustainable, resilient, smarter ways to produce. My father's expression hardened. You think you're smarter than the people who built this company? He asked. Jason chuckled quietly, the sound sharp in the stillness. My mother reached for her napkin, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Let's just enjoy dinner." I pushed my plate away and excused myself, knowing I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Leaving home for California felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. At Stanford, the air itself seemed different, lighter, curious, alive. The questions that had always earned me sighs at home now sparked entire conversations. Professors wanted to hear what I thought. Classmates debated with me instead of dismissing me. That first semester, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. When I met Dr. Elise Porter, she became the first person to tell me that discomfort wasn't failure, it was friction, and friction meant progress. You're not trying to destroy the system, she said one afternoon as sunlight streamed across her office whiteboard. You're trying to redesign it, and the people who profit from the old way will always resist that. Her words gave shape to everything I'd felt growing up. For the first time, I understood that my father's disapproval wasn't personal. It was a defense mechanism. The old guard fears change, especially when it comes from someone they never expected to lead it. I poured myself into research building models of cleaner industrial systems that used renewable energy to power manufacturing plants. I spent weekends in the lab and summers in field trials. The work was grueling, but it made sense. It had purpose. Meanwhile, Jason's life unfolded like a highlight reel. Promotions magazine features corporate events. He was the face of Hale Industrial's next generation. My parents flew out for his speaking engagements and sent press clippings to relatives. When they called me, it was to ask when I'd visit or whether I'd found a job yet. I learned to give short answers. There was no point explaining that I was working towards something bigger than a paycheck. They didn't want to understand it, and I no longer needed their approval to keep going. Still, some part of me hoped they'd notice the difference, that they'd see what I was building wasn't rebellion, it was reinvention. But every visit home reminded me that nothing had changed. The house was still immaculate, the conversation still one-sided. My father still talked about margins, Jason still dominated the room, and my mother still smiled through the tension. I played the part they expected, sitting quietly, asking about Jason's new project, pretending I didn't see the flicker of disappointment when they looked at me. Underneath the polite small talk, there was a truth none of us could say aloud. I was never going to fit into their version of success. It was during one of those visits that I overheard my father talking with Jason in his study. "She's bright," he said, "but not built for this world. Idealists burn out. The company needs realism." Jason agreed, his voice smooth and certain. "Don't worry about Maddie. She'll find her place eventually." I stood outside the door, invisible as ever, and realized that my place would never exist inside that house or that company. I would have to build it myself. The next morning, I packed my bag, hugged my mother goodbye, and told her I'd call when I landed. She nodded, her eyes glassy, but her smile composed. My father didn't come downstairs. Jason texted me later, a single line, "Good luck saving the world." It was meant to sting, and it did, but not in the way he thought. It didn't make me feel small. It made me certain that I would. On the flight back to California, I watched the clouds pass beneath the wing and thought about every time they had told me no. No, your ideas won't work. No, your goals aren't realistic. No, that's not how we do things. And somewhere between takeoff and landing, I made myself a promise I would stop asking for permission to be taken seriously. Because one day, the same family that called my work a fantasy would have to face a future built on everything they once dismissed, and they wouldn't even see it coming. The years after Stanford were nothing like I expected. I thought I'd graduate, get a job at one of the big firms, maybe even earn enough respect to make my father see what I'd become. Instead, the industry didn't want someone with ideas. It wanted someone who would fit quietly into its old designs. So I stopped waiting for permission and built something of my own. It started with a borrowed desk in a co-working space and a used laptop that overheated if I ran too many simulations. I called it Verdant Systems, a small company with a big mission to modernize factory infrastructure with clean, efficient technology. Tasha was the first to join me. We met at a research event in Oakland, both tired of watching innovation get buried under corporate politics. She had a background in environmental policy, sharp instincts, and a sense of humor that made long nights bearable. Together, we worked out of a shared office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, surrounded by other small startups chasing impossible dreams. Some days it felt like the walls themselves were cheering us on. Other days, they felt like they were closing in. Money was tight. I learned how to stretch every dollar living off instant noodles and secondhand furniture. There were months when payroll came before rent, and I spent nights on the office couch with my laptop glowing beside me. The noise from the street outside mixed with the hum of servers, and sometimes that sound was the only thing reminding me that I was moving forward. We didn't have prestige or powerful connections, but we had persistence, and that was enough to keep going. Our first breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a small manufacturing plant in Reno that had been struggling to stay afloat. Their manager had read about our prototype system online and decided to take a chance. It was a modest contract, but it gave us a foothold. I spent weeks on site adjusting designs, rewriting code, and talking to the crew about what they actually needed instead of what the manuals said they should want. When the results came in a 30% drop in energy use and improved output, word started to spread. One factory led to another, then another. Within a year, Verdant Systems had clients across 3 states. We weren't making anyone rich, but we were proving something real. I brought on 2 more people. Jasper Lee, a quiet engineer with a mind for systems optimization, and Noah Patel, a supply chain analyst who had left a bigger firm after seeing how they greenwashed their numbers. I couldn't offer them much, just a small salary, a promise of equity, and a chance to make a difference. They both said yes without hesitation. We were a strange little family. Days blurred into nights, and our office became part lab, part living room. There were times we argued over models and strategy, but we always ended up laughing about it over takeout. Every new client felt like a victory we had fought for together. At home, though, none of that mattered. My parents knew I was doing something with renewable energy, but to them it was still a hobby. My father rarely asked about my work. When he did, it was usually at a dinner table crowded with relatives, as if he wanted an audience for my answers. Still tinkering with climate projects, he'd say, pouring himself a drink. Jason would smirk and follow up with, "Or have you moved on to something real yet?" I'd smile steady and practiced. We just helped a plant in the Midwest cut emissions by 45% while increasing output, I'd reply. Then I'd watch their faces settle into polite disbelief. In their world, success meant market dominance and legacy holdings, not sustainability contracts or startup awards. My mother tried to soften the tension with her gentle tone, steering the conversation back to safer topics like travel plans or charity events. But the message was always clear. My accomplishments lived outside their definition of family pride. Over time, I stopped trying to explain. I attended family gatherings out of obligation, smiled for pictures, and left early. The more my company grew, the less I felt connected to the people who were supposed to understand me most. The distance wasn't just emotional, it was generational. My father had built his life on the belief that industry was unshakable, that the system he'd inherited was proof against change. I was building something that questioned all of it. By our 3rd year, Verdant Systems had begun to attract attention from investors. We weren't chasing big capital just enough to expand and develop our software platform. I still handled most client meetings myself, traveling from state to state, collecting data, refining designs, and convincing small business owners that innovation didn't have to mean risk. The long drives gave me time to think about how far I'd come from the girl who once kept quiet at the dinner table. The more success we found, the clearer it became that the old ways my father held sacred were starting to crack. Industry chatter hinted that Hale Industrial was struggling with compliance costs and losing clients to newer, more adaptive companies. It wasn't public yet, but the signs were there. Delays, downsizing, missed deadlines. I noticed the tension on my father's face during our next visit, though he covered it well. Jason deflected questions with rehearsed confidence, insisting everything was under control. At one family dinner, Jason leaned across the table and asked, So, Maddie, when are you going to do something real with your life? Hale Industrial could use your communication skills. I looked up from my plate, calm but steady. We're doing fine on our own, I said. Our systems helped 3 plants cut costs by 1/3 this year. My father gave a small laugh, the kind that ended conversations. That's cute, sweetheart, he said. But real business isn't about passion. It's about staying power. Let's see if you're still around in 5 years. His words stayed with me long after the table was cleared, not as an insult, but as a reminder of the wall between us, the unspoken rule that only his version of success counted. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I knew Verdant Systems was built to last, not because we had inherited power, but because we had earned purpose. By the end of that year, we had landed a grant from the Department of Energy for our carbon reduction software. It was the validation I'd been working toward, a sign that we were no longer a small operation fighting for attention. Yet, I kept it to myself. I didn't tell my parents or Jason. The news would have sounded like another experiment to them, and I was tired of watching their pride falter into dismissal. The silence between us became easier than confrontation. I focused on my work, and they focused on theirs. We lived in parallel worlds, touching only for holidays and brief check-ins. But even as the gap widened, I couldn't help noticing the change in my father's voice when we spoke. It had lost some of its usual certainty, replaced by something else, maybe exhaustion, maybe denial. Looking back, those quiet years were the hardest, not because of what I lacked, but because of what I finally understood. I had built something real, something functional, measurable, and alive. But the people I wanted to see it the most had chosen not to look. And somewhere deep down, I knew that the silence would not last forever. The world my father built was starting to crumble, and sooner or later, his downfall and my rise would meet in the same place. By the time Verdant Systems turned 4, the signs of trouble at Hale Industrial were becoming impossible to ignore. It started quietly tucked into industry newsletters and business blogs, short paragraphs about a long-standing company facing operational challenges and supply chain disruptions. On paper, the numbers still looked strong, but anyone who'd been in manufacturing long enough could read between the lines. Missed delivery schedules, aging plants, and stalled technology upgrades had begun eroding the foundation my father spent his life defending. I noticed first through our clients. 2 small distributors that once worked exclusively with Hale Industrial reached out to us for consulting. They were looking for automation solutions, the kind Hale had never offered. One of them, a plant manager from Arizona, told me quietly over coffee, "Your family's company is good people, but they're still running like it's 1998. I didn't correct him. I just took notes. At first, I wanted to help. No part of me took pleasure in seeing Hale Industrial lose ground. I still remembered being that girl who wanted her father's approval more than any contract. So I asked him to meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, no boardroom, no audience. He agreed, though, reluctantly. We met at a small cafe downtown, one of those quiet places with cracked leather booths and the smell of roasted beans that reminded me of college study nights. When he sat down, he didn't take off his coat. He looked at me the same way he used to look at junior analysts, patient but detached. I slid a few pages of printed data across the table charts, showing the inefficiency in one of his factories compared to an upgraded Verdant model. "Dad," I said softly, "I know this isn't what you're used to seeing, but we can reduce your costs by 30% in 6 months if we integrate our system." He glanced at the papers, but didn't touch them. "Madison," he said finally, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Hale Industrial doesn't need saving. We've been through tougher times." His tone was calm, but final. "We've lasted 70 years doing what we do best. We'll be fine." I wanted to argue, but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't rejecting the data. He was rejecting me. Accepting my help would mean admitting that the daughter he'd once dismissed as idealistic might have built something stronger than his own empire. So I gathered the papers back into my folder and left without another word. Back at Verdant, I poured that frustration into focus. We had just been awarded a Department of Energy grant for our carbon reduction software, and new clients were signing faster than we could onboard them. Tasha reminded me that growth had its own momentum now. Even if I wasn't ready to believe it, the numbers spoke for themselves. We started developing a new analytics platform. Predictive maintenance, adaptive scheduling, and compliance tracking rolled into one. Jasper handled the systems logic, while Noah built out the data models that could forecast energy usage weeks ahead of time. Watching them work was like seeing the future assemble itself in front of me. Still, every family dinner felt like stepping backward in time. My father never mentioned the cafe meeting again. Jason filled the silence with stories about market expansions and strategic positioning, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. At one dinner, he leaned over his glass and said, "Dad says you're doing well, Maddie. Maybe we'll have you consult for us someday." I smiled and nodded, but inside I felt something quiet and sharp take root, a recognition that they would never see me as an equal. Over the next year, the market confirmed what my father refused to admit. Hale Industrial's profit margins fell 12% year over year. The press blamed everything from global logistics issues to rising regulatory costs, but anyone watching closely knew it wasn't the world changing, it was them standing still. One evening, I sat in our office long after everyone had left. The city lights outside reflected in the glass, merging with the glow of our screens. Tasha walked in with 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. "They'll call you eventually," she said. "Maybe not to admit it, but because they'll have no choice." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. That call didn't come from my father, though. It came from someone inside Hale Industrial, a senior engineer named Mark Garrison, who had been with the company longer than I'd been alive. He reached out through LinkedIn asking for a confidential conversation. When we met the next day, he looked exhausted. "The new Texas plant," he said, lowering his voice, "it's bleeding money. Outdated machines, poor layout, no automation. We told leadership months ago, but they won't change a thing. They're building a monument to the past, not a company for the future." I drove home that night in silence, replaying his words. Every number I'd tracked, every rumor I'd heard, it all lined up. Hale Industrial wasn't just stumbling, it was on the verge of collapse. And still my father was pretending everything was fine. The next family gathering confirmed it. The usual laughter felt forced, the air heavier than before. My father looked older, the lines on his face deeper, but his pride hadn't budged. Jason drank more than usual, his jokes landing flat. When I mentioned Verdant's latest partnership with Calcan Energy, a 3-year contract across 6 facilities, my father barely reacted. "Good for you," he said, his tone distant. Then he turned to Jason and added, "We're expanding into Texas. Vertical integration is the future." I almost laughed. They couldn't even integrate basic data systems, and here he was talking about innovation, like a slogan. But I stayed quiet. Arguing wouldn't change him. That night, when I got home, I opened my laptop and began to outline something I had never dared to consider before, a full acquisition model. It started as a hypothetical exercise. I listed the company's assets, debts, key partnerships, and what it would take to bring them under Verdant's umbrella. I wasn't sure if I was angry, hopeful, or both, but as the numbers started to add up, the idea no longer felt impossible. Hale Industrial wasn't worthless, it was simply mismanaged. Under the right leadership, it could become what it was always meant to be: efficient, sustainable, future-facing. The next week, I received another message, this time from Richard Torres, a consultant I'd met at a sustainability conference. He used to be a Hale Industrial executive before moving into private advisory work. Off the record, his message read, "They're exploring options. Talk of selling quietly. Charles is refusing all pivots. Jason's out of his depth." I sat there for a long time reading that message over and over. My father's name in another man's assessment of failure felt strange, like seeing his reflection crack. For years, I'd dreamed of proving myself to him. Now I was realizing the only way to do that might be by taking the very thing he'd built and saving it myself. I closed my laptop and stared out the window, the city lights shimmering in the distance. For the first time, I didn't feel small or defensive. I felt ready. The thought of buying Hale Industrial, of reclaiming it from within, no longer seemed like a fantasy. It was a plan forming quietly, cleanly, and for once entirely on my terms. And as the idea settled into place, one truth became clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption for me, for the company, and maybe one day for my father too. The night I read Richard Torres's message, the city outside my apartment felt unnaturally quiet. His words echoed in my head. They're exploring options. Talk of selling quietly. Richard's refusing all pivots. Jason's out of his depth. I sat there staring at my screen, the soft light washing over the documents I'd already begun drafting in secret, early models valuation charts, projected savings. For months the idea had felt too bold to speak aloud, but now it felt inevitable. Buying Hale Industrial wasn't about revenge. It was the only way to save what was left of it, and maybe in the process save what was left of my family's legacy too. I spent that night sketching a plan that would take shape piece by piece. It had to be quiet, clean, and untraceable until every signature was dry. The next morning, I called a meeting with Tasha, Jasper, and Noah. We gathered in the small conference room of our Oakland office, sunlight filtering through the blinds. I stood by the whiteboard, hands resting on the back of a chair, and said, "I need to show you something, and I need your honesty." They watched as I pulled up the data, Hale Industrial's financial reports, leaked board minutes, and a full breakdown of their aging assets. "They're weeks away from a liquidity crisis," I said. "The Texas plant alone is burning through nearly $500,000 a month. If they sell, they'll do it out of desperation. And if they sell to the wrong group, those plants will shut down and every worker there will lose their job." Tasha frowned, crossing her arms. "You want to acquire them," she said slowly. "Not partner. Acquire." I nodded. "Through a holding company. Something neutral. Something that won't trace back to us until it's done." For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the HVAC filled the silence. Then Jasper leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly. "If you pull this off," he said, "this would be full circle. The company they told you you'd never understand, saved by you." Noah looked between us, then nodded. "It's risky," he said. "But the math checks out. The assets are worth saving. And if anyone can rebuild it, it's us." That was all I needed to hear. Within the week, Verdant Systems quietly formed a holding company called Northlight Capital. I hired an independent mergers firm out of Chicago to act as the intermediary. Every move we made went through layers of confidentiality agreements. Verdant's name would never appear in the early paperwork. I spent hours every night reviewing contracts and restructuring plans. I barely slept living on coffee and adrenaline. The plan had to be airtight, no leaks, no second chances. While we waited for a response from Hale Industrial's board, I went about business as usual during the day, visiting clients, reviewing projects, pretending nothing monumental was unfolding behind the scenes. It didn't take long before the mergers firm called back. Hale Industrial was considering the offer quietly, cautiously, but seriously. The timing aligned perfectly. Their board was fractured, morale was low, and investors were anxious. They needed capital, and they needed it fast. Still, I couldn't let myself believe it until I saw the papers. I'd learned too much from my father to assume victory before the ink dried. Weeks passed every day, a careful balance between calm professionalism and the quiet hum of nerves beneath my skin. When I finally received word that the board had agreed to move forward with Northlight's proposal, I sat back in my chair and stared at the email for a long time. It felt unreal, like the ground beneath me had shifted. The annual Hale Family Summer Gala was just days away. Every year it was the same, a sprawling backyard filled with executives, family friends, and former colleagues, people who spoke in polished sentences and measured smiles. I hadn't planned on going. I hadn't gone in years, actually. But this time was different. The acquisition was still under review, but the closing was near. In a matter of days, I would own Hale Industrial. Tasha tried to talk me out of attending. "You don't owe them a show," she said. "You've already won." But it wasn't about the show. It was about closure, about standing there in the same space where I'd spent years shrinking myself and knowing I didn't have to anymore. The night of the gala arrived warm and heavy, the sky threaded with gold from the string lights that lined the Hale estate. The air buzzed with laughter and the low clink of glasses. I walked through the gate in a deep green dress, simple but sharp. My hair pulled back, my posture steady. I could feel eyes turning as I stepped into the crowd. Jason spotted me first. "Well, look who finally decided to join us," he said, smiling like he'd just spotted an old classmate. Still running your little sustainability project?" I smiled back. "Something like that." My father joined us a moment later, a glass of bourbon in hand. He looked tired but composed. "Madison," he said, nodding. "Didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't going to," I admitted. "But it felt like the right night." He chuckled. "Well, tonight's not about small ventures or side projects. Tonight we celebrate legacy." Legacy. That word again. The one they used like armor. The speeches began an hour later. Guests gathered under a white canopy while the string quartet softened their tempo. Jason took the stage microphone in hand, his voice polished and confident. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "It's been a challenging year, but tonight I'm proud to announce a new chapter for Hale Industrial. We've secured an acquisition agreement that ensures our company's future fresh capital global reach and continued leadership under the Hale family name." The crowd erupted into applause. My father beamed. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Jason continued, his voice brimming with pride. "Our new partners at Northlight Capital share our vision for progress and tradition. Together, we'll lead Hale Industrial into its strongest decade yet." That was my cue. I stepped forward from the crowd, my heels clicking against the stone patio. The microphone squealed slightly as Jason glanced at me confused. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and steady, "there's something you should all know about Northlight Capital." The room fell silent. Heads turned. My father's brows furrowed. "Northlight," I continued, "is the holding company that finalized Hale Industrial's acquisition this morning. The paperwork was signed at 11:17 a.m. I paused, looking directly at my father. "And Northlight was created by Verdant Systems. My company." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the sound of glass breaking echoed near the bar. My father's drink had slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble. Jason stepped forward, his face pale. "You're lying," he said quietly. "I'm not," I said. "You signed the deal. You just didn't know who was behind it." The guests whispered, the room shifting like a wave. My father's expression hardened. "This is some kind of stunt," he said. "No," I replied. "It's a solution. I offered help before. You refused. So I found another way." Jason's voice broke through the noise, sharp with disbelief. "You bought your way in out of spite, out of necessity," I said. "Hale Industrial was failing. I couldn't let it die when I had the tools to rebuild it." My father stared at me, his jaw tight. "You think you can run my company?" "I already do," I said softly. "And I didn't come here for revenge. I came to offer you a choice. You can walk away, or you can help me lead it forward together, but on new terms." The silence that followed felt endless. Then, without a word, my father turned and walked out through the glass doors, the crowd parting in front of him. Jason followed his footsteps, loud and angry. Only my mother remained. She stood slowly, eyes glistening, and crossed the room toward me. When she reached me, she touched my cheek. "You're your grandfather's fire," she whispered. He'd have been proud. It was the first time she had ever said those words. The night faded around us as guests murmured and cameras flashed quietly at the edges of the room. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the daughter they overlooked. I was the woman standing at the center of everything they thought I couldn't do. And the next morning, the headlines would prove it. The morning after the gala, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Every outlet from Forbes to the Chronicle wanted a statement. Headlines filled the news cycle. Startup CEO secretly acquires industrial giant. It was surreal reading those words next to my name. But beneath the excitement, I knew the real work was just beginning. Owning Hale Industrial was one thing. Rebuilding it was another. Inside the company, the reaction was cautious, even hostile. The older executives saw me as a disruptor, a threat to everything familiar. Some employees avoided eye contact in the hallways. Others whispered that I'd stolen the business out from under my own family. I understood their fear. I had walked into those same boardrooms once as a daughter dismissed before I'd even spoken. Now I walked in as their boss. Jason took it the hardest. Within days, he hired a team of lawyers to comb through the acquisition paperwork looking for any weakness. He didn't find one. The sale had been clean by the book and unanimously approved by the board before they knew my name was behind it. After a week of public silence, he resigned from his position, calling it a necessary personal step. I didn't fight it. Sometimes letting go was its own form of peace. My father didn't speak to me either, not publicly, not privately. The only trace of his voice came through a short email sent the morning after the press conference. Madison, I hope you know what you're doing. R. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I didn't yet know how to answer that truthfully. 2 weeks later, my mother called. Her tone was warm, but measured the way she used to sound when trying to mediate between my father and me. Would you have lunch with me? She asked. No business talk, just us. We met at a small cafe near the bay. She looked tired but beautiful, wearing the same pearl earrings she'd had since I was a child. After a few minutes of quiet conversation, she reached across the table and said, You really did it. I nodded, unsure what to say. You know, she went on, your grandfather built Hale Industrial with his hands. Your father built its reputation. But you... She paused, her eyes softening. You might be the one who gives it a future. Her voice trembled on the last word, and for a moment all the years between us dissolved. I didn't need her to apologize for the past. That sentence was enough. Back at headquarters, the first few months were the hardest I'd ever lived through. Hale Industrial had 70 years of history embedded in its walls, old systems, old contracts, and old habits that resisted every attempt at change. I started by merging departments that overlapped with verdant systems. It was messy emotional work. Entire teams had to relearn how to communicate, how to track data, how to measure success. Clara Mitchell, the HR director who'd worked under my father for nearly 2 decades, confronted me during one of the early staff meetings. You're asking people to let go of everything they've known, she said. Some of them don't trust technology. They trust routine. I understand, I told her. But routine is what's been sinking this company. We can't fix the future by holding on to the past. She studied me for a long time, then sighed. Your father would have said that differently. I know, I replied quietly. That's why it might actually work this time. Clara didn't smile, but she didn't argue again either. Over the next few months, she became one of my strongest allies. Change had a way of winning people over when it started to show results. We focused first on the Texas plant, the same one that had nearly bankrupted the company. The equipment was outdated, the layout inefficient, and the energy systems painfully wasteful. Our verdant engineers spent weeks assessing every inch of it. Then over 90 days, we replaced the power grid with smart automation, installed sensor-based energy monitoring, and implemented our predictive maintenance software. 3 months later, the numbers came in: a 37% reduction in energy waste, a 20% boost in output, and 0 safety incidents. The workers who had once been skeptical were now volunteering to train others. For the first time in years, Hale Industrial's internal reports listed growth instead of recovery. One afternoon, as I walked through the plant's main floor, a foreman named Jim stopped me. His hands were still coated in dust from the line, but his voice was steady. Didn't think this place could bounce back, he said. Guess I was wrong. You weren't wrong, I told him. It just needed a new start. He smiled, then the kind of honest, tired smile that meant more than any boardroom praise. Back in Oakland, our verdant office was buzzing. The merger had doubled our staff, and new clients were approaching us faster than we could schedule meetings. Jasper and Noah split their time between training and analytics. Tasha ran operations with her usual quiet precision. Every day was a blur of conference calls, project reviews, and policy overhauls. But somewhere in the chaos, the vision that had once felt impossible was finally real. Then one morning, my assistant handed me a package. Inside was a worn hardcover book, a biography of Ray Anderson, the industrialist known for pioneering sustainability in business. Tucked between the pages was a note in familiar handwriting. Sustainability isn't the enemy of business. I see that now. You were ahead of us all. Dad. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. I read them 3 times before setting the note down beside my keyboard. It wasn't an apology. It was something deeper, a recognition. The kind he had never been able to give me when it mattered most. From that day forward, things began to shift quietly. My father didn't return to the company, but he called occasionally short conversations about strategy or new energy regulations. He even accepted my offer to serve as chair of legacy relations, an advisory role that preserved his dignity while giving him space to see what we were building. My mother visited the new headquarters, often walking the halls like she was rediscovering a piece of the family that had once fractured. The company itself had changed too. The board meetings that used to drag on for hours now began with updates about sustainability milestones and ended with new ideas for future development. Employee retention climbed, waste and emissions dropped. For the first time in the company's history, Hale, Industrial, and Verdant were profitable and ethical in the same sentence. Late one evening, as I stood by the window overlooking the city skyline, I thought about how far we had come. The girl who once sat quietly at her father's dinner table had become the woman leading his company into the future he could never imagine. But the victory didn't feel like conquest. It felt like peace. The next day, when I walked into the building that now carried both logos, Hale Verdant Industries, the security guard at the front desk, smiled and said, "Good morning, Ms. Hale. Welcome home." I smiled back because for the first time it truly was. Still, I knew there was one thing left undone. My father and I had never faced what had really broken us, the years of silence, of dismissal, of seeing each other as opponents instead of family. That conversation was coming, and when it did, it would finally close the distance that business alone could never fix. My father and I hadn't been in the same room since the merger. Months had passed full of long workdays, investor calls, and endless travel between facilities. We spoke only through short, polite emails, updates on board meetings or policy drafts that required his signature as honorary chair. But beneath every exchange, I could feel the silence that still stretched between us, wide and heavy. One Friday morning, Clara walked into my office with a folder in hand. "Richard Hale requested a visit," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "He asked if it could be private." I looked up from my screen, surprised but not entirely unprepared. I'd been waiting for that call without realizing it. "Schedule it for this afternoon," I said. The hours leading up to it dragged. By the time he arrived, the office had gone quiet, most of the team already gone for the weekend. I met him in the main conference room where the late light poured through the tall windows. He looked smaller somehow, not weaker, but human. His suit was immaculate as always, but the edges of his confidence had softened. "Madison," he said, nodding as he stepped inside. "You've done a lot with this place." "Thank you," I replied. "We've worked hard." He placed a hand on the back of a chair but didn't sit. I wanted to see it for myself. The reports, the articles, they don't show everything. I gestured for him to sit, and he did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The hum of the city outside filled the quiet space between us. Finally, he said, "When I first started at Hale Industrial, I thought leadership was about control, keeping everything steady, no surprises. I spent my life trying to hold the world still. I listened, letting his words unfold at their own pace. You didn't try to hold it still." He continued, his eyes meeting mine. "You turned it upside down." And somehow it landed better than before. I didn't know what to say. For years I had imagined this moment, the one where he might finally see me, not as the daughter who disappointed him, but as the woman who carried his legacy forward in her own way. Hearing him admit it out loud felt like air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small, folded note across the table. "You sent me an offer last year," he said. "A position, legacy relations." "Yes," I said quietly. "You never responded." He nodded. "Because I thought it was a courtesy. I didn't think you meant it." "I meant it," I said. "I wanted you to stay connected, not as a symbol but as a guide. This company has your fingerprints all over it. That doesn't go away." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then to my surprise, he smiled, small but real. "If you're still offering, I'd like to accept." The words hung in the air, almost fragile. I nodded, trying not to let the emotion show in my voice. "Welcome back, Dad." The weeks that followed were quiet but meaningful. He visited the office a few times a week, usually early in the morning when most of the team hadn't arrived. He'd walk the halls talking with engineers, asking questions about systems he didn't fully understand but wanted to. It wasn't about oversight anymore. It was curiosity, the same spark that had once driven him before pride got in the way. Jason, however, remained distant. After leaving the company, he had joined a private investment group on the East Coast. My mother mentioned that he was still bitter convinced that I'd stolen what was his by right. I didn't know how to fix that yet, but I hoped time might. Meanwhile, Hale Verdant thrived. Every quarter brought a growth, financial, environmental, and cultural. The merger between innovation and legacy had become a model other corporations studied. Tasha joked that we were teaching old industries new tricks. But for me, the real victory came quietly. It came in moments like watching my father and Clara reviewing new employee programs together, or hearing longtime workers proudly describe the Hale Verdant way to new hires. The bitterness that had once filled those hallways had turned into something else, something like purpose. One afternoon, my father stopped by my office holding a stack of old ledgers. "Found these in storage," he said. "Your grandfather's handwriting. He tracked every expense down to the penny." I smiled as I took one from him. The yellowed pages smelled faintly of oil and dust. "He built the foundation," I said. "And you rebuilt it," my father added. "Better." There was no pride in his tone, only truth. For him, that was the highest compliment he could give. Later that week, the board hosted a small dinner to celebrate our record-breaking year. It was held at the downtown headquarters, not the mansion where most Hale gatherings once took place. The tables were lined with simple greenery, the air filled with quiet laughter. When it came time for speeches, the board chair invited my father to say a few words. He stood at the podium, the same man who had once commanded rooms, with his certainty now speaking with something far more powerful humility. When this company began, he said we measured success in numbers, production, profit, growth. But over time, those numbers started to mean less than the people who created them. He looked toward me, his voice steady. "It took my daughter to remind me that legacy isn't something you preserve. It's something you pass on." The room fell silent, and for a moment all I could do was breathe. Afterward, he found me near the back of the room where the lights were softer. "You were right," he said quietly, "about everything. I just wasn't ready to see it." I shook my head. "You taught me what it means to build something that lasts. I just built it differently." He reached out and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Different," he said, smiling faintly. That's the word I should have chosen years ago. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, no grand apology or tearful moment, but it was real, and it was enough. That night, as I left the building, the city skyline shimmered against the glass. I thought about my grandfather's ledgers, my father's decades of leadership, and the path that had led me here. I realized that redemption didn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it came through quiet understanding. The next morning, when I arrived at the office, I noticed something new in the lobby. The bronze plaque that once read Hale Industrial Group had been replaced. It now said Hale Verdant Industries Innovation Through Generations. I ran my hand over the cool metal tracing the engraved letters. It wasn't just a name, it was a bridge between everything we had been and everything we had yet to become. Still, there was one more chapter waiting to be written. My father and I had found peace, but my brother hadn't, and before this story could truly close, I knew I'd have to face him one last time. The call came on a quiet Sunday morning. My mother's voice was calm but deliberate as she said, "Jason's in town. He wants to talk." I hadn't seen my brother since the night of the gala. We'd spoken only through lawyers and formal correspondence cold exchanges that felt more like business than family. But something in her tone told me this wasn't another confrontation. It was something different. We met that afternoon at a small cafe near the marina. Jason arrived first, sitting by the window with a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. He looked older, though, not in years, more in the way people look when they've been carrying too much pride for too long. When I walked in, he stood halfway, then stopped, unsure whether to shake my hand or hug me. I offered a small smile. "Hi, Jason." He nodded. "You look settled," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. "So do you," I answered. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Not exactly. I've spent the past year trying to convince myself I didn't care, that what happened was unfair, that you took something that should have been mine." He stared out the window, watching the boats drift in the harbor. But every deal I've made since then feels empty. And every headline about Hale Verdant reminds me you didn't destroy the company, you saved it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sunlight flickered across the table between us. I never wanted to take it from you, I said. I wanted to keep it from dying. Dad's way wasn't working anymore. You know that. Jason nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. He looked down at his hands. I just didn't want to admit it. You were always the one with ideas. I was the one who played by the rules. I thought that made me safe. It made you loyal, I said softly. And there's nothing wrong with that. But things change. He smiled faintly, then reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small envelope toward me. Inside was a letter on crisp paper, his formal resignation from his investment firm. I'm done chasing things that don't matter, he said. If there's room for me, I'd like to come home. Not as an executive, maybe something new, something useful. I looked at him, searching for the arrogance that used to fill every word he spoke. It wasn't there, just honesty. There's always been room, I said. You just had to want to stand beside me, not in front of me. That afternoon marked the quietest, simplest reconciliation of my life. No apologies, no grand speeches. Just understanding the kind that comes too late for words, but right on time for peace. Months passed, and the company grew stronger. Jason joined the outreach division, building partnerships with renewable startups across the Midwest. My father eased into his advisory role, offering insight without interference. My mother, now happily retired, spent her days tending her garden and bringing us casseroles. She swore were for the staff, even though everyone knew they were really for me. One crisp autumn morning, we gathered in the courtyard of the new headquarters for the unveiling of a memorial wall, one dedicated to the generations who had built the company from the ground up. My father stood beside me, his hands resting on the cane he refused to call necessary. Jason and I lifted the cloth together, revealing a bronze plaque etched with 3 names: Thomas Hale, Richard Hale, Madison Hale. Underneath it read, "Innovation through Legacy." As the small crowd applauded, I caught my father watching me. His eyes were bright, not with pride, but with peace. When the ceremony ended, he leaned toward me and said quietly, "Your grandfather would have been proud of this. I finally understand why you fought so hard." I smiled, feeling something inside me finally settle. "I didn't fight against you," I said. "I fought for what we all built. I just couldn't do it your way." He nodded once, a slow, knowing gesture. And thank God for that. That night, long after the celebration ended, I walked alone through the building. The halls were lit softly, the hum of machines faint in the distance. I paused outside the glass doors leading to the production floor, the same kind of space where my father had once built his empire, where I had once dreamed of creating my own. Now it was both. Standing there, I realized the journey hadn't been about victory at all. It was about rewriting what legacy meant. It wasn't a title to inherit or a name on a plaque. It was the courage to evolve without erasing what came before. My father built the past. I built the bridge to what's next. And somehow we'd met in the middle. Before I left, I turned off the lights and looked out across the city skyline. The reflection of our company's name shimmered faintly in the window. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fight won. It felt like a home found. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It doesn't come in applause or headlines. It comes in small moments of grace, when pride softens, when family heals, when truth finally has room to breathe. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from the pieces someone else left behind, I hope this story reminds you that peace isn't weakness, it's strength made quiet. And if it spoke to you, take a moment to share it or simply let it rest with you. Because sometimes the most powerful endings aren't about triumph, they're about understanding.